her testimony in the case, find the defendant as to count 1, murder, guilty. As to count 2, obstruction of justice, guilty.
A jury of 5 men and 3 women unanimously found Dr. Martin MacNeill guilty of first-degree murder and obstruction of justice in his wife's death. The verdict came down about 1 a.m. on Saturday after the jury deliberated more than 11 hours. Criminal defense attorney Greg Skordas has been following the trial with us, of course, and he's joining us this afternoon to talk more about the verdict. Guilty. Were you expecting that?
You know, I wish I could say I saw that in the crystal ball. I expected the verdict would come back somewhat later than it did. 11 hours may seem like a long time, but after a 3-week trial, I thought that the jury would deliberate a little longer than that. But the verdict itself was no surprise, although I think the verdict wouldn't have been a surprise either way. I know that's sort of a cop-out, but it was a tough case that could have gone either way.
So you think it could have gone either way, but it doesn't surprise you that he was found guilty. And I wanted to talk about the circumstantial evidence because a lot of people may have looked at this case and said, there's so much of that, so much circumstantial evidence. No one ever ruled Michelle's death a homicide, that she was murdered. So how was the jury able to reach a guilty verdict based on that alone?
That's exactly why I wouldn't have been surprised at a not guilty verdict, because this case was based almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. There was no eyewitness, and except for some sort of shaky jailhouse snitches, there was no evidence of a confession, if you will. We don't, as you said, even have a medical examiner who was willing to get up on the stand and say this woman was murdered. So the state had to put together a lot of building blocks, a lot of circumstantial evidence that put together, all weighed together, convinced a jury beyond a reasonable doubt that this was a homicide.
What do you think the strongest evidence was when you talk about circumstantial evidence? What do you think was that sticking point that got the jury thinking he's guilty?
Oh, maybe 2 things. One, the state spent the first part of the trial establishing sort of a really tawdry character for this man, that he was a bad person, and even had his own daughter get up on the stand and testify against him. And then I think what really sort of put the nail in the coffin, if you will, was the jailhouse informants. And I've already said they weren't the most reliable people in the world, but to have him actually, his own words finally were heard by the jury saying, I did it, or using some very profane words to describe his life.
We're saying the jury heard in his own words. That was according to these former cellmates, right? In their words. But you're saying the strongest, of course, to have your own children testify against a father, that in itself is pretty strong.
That was the most compelling witness that I saw. The daughter, that's Alexis is her name, she's a doctor herself, very articulate, very beautiful, just a great witness, and we all saw her, and she was very strong. And to testify against your own father, I think a jury sitting back going, well, if his own daughter believes he did this, who are we to second guess that? That was hard.
Interesting. And of course, clearly MacNeill's attorneys plan on appealing. On what grounds are they going to appeal, and do they really have a legitimate shot at this?
Well, everybody has a right to an appeal, and he'll certainly take that right. Appeals being granted in a case like this would be pretty rare, but I assume the most obvious appeal issue would be what we call sufficiency of the evidence. Basically going to the Supreme Court and saying, how could a jury have convicted him based on the weak, if you will, I'm sure that's the defense argument, evidence. So sufficiency of the evidence is one of their stronger issues, but a court of appeals is very reluctant to set aside a jury's finding, especially after they heard and saw the witnesses and saw their demeanor.
Now, one person that we didn't hear from, of course, was Dr. Martin MacNeill himself. Looking back now, do you think the defense should have put him on the stand to testify, considering that his character was attacked so much?
I think the defense did a great job, and I wouldn't pretend to second guess them. I think putting him on would have made this about a 4-hour verdict of guilty. So I don't think he was going to be a good witness, and I think that they were smart keeping him off the stand.
Okay, his sentencing is in January. So how does the system work here in Utah in terms of who decides how much time he'll die in prison?
The short answer is yes. The state's going to do what's called a pre-sentence investigating report, find out more about him. The judge can only send him to prison for 15 to life on the one count and 1 to 15 on the other, maybe run them consecutive or concurrent. The Board of Pardons will decide how much of that 15 to life he'll serve. But he's not a young man, and on a good day, you would expect that he would do at least 30 years for this type of homicide. That's essentially a death penalty.
A death sentence, if you think about it. Quickly, Gypsy Willis, we were talking about it earlier that she may have faced perjury charges, that the prosecution was weighing that. On what basis was that all about? And wasn't she also a key witness?
Right.
And granted.
Right. I would expect they're done with her. I mean, they may say, well, you lied on the stand, and there were some things we expected from you that we didn't get.
But they couldn't ask for more. They got the guilty verdict that they wanted.
Right. I would hope that they're done with her.
All right, Greg, thank you so much. It's been fascinating talking to you about this. Appreciate it so much. Appreciate your time.